and good afternoon to you all, and thank you very much for joining what we hope will be an important, interesting and informative session of this spring conference. So my name is Sarah Hamidudin. I will be moderating this session. I'm a member of the BSI Governance Committee G1 that develops standards on good practice in organisational governance. And doing things like organisational governance, risk management, fraud and corruption prevention, and modern slavery risk management. So BSI staff and a very dedicated team of volunteers are in the final stages of developing a British standard to guide organisations in managing modern slavery risks in operations, supply chains, and the wider operating environment. So today we want to contextualise this important information by hearing from someone who has direct experience of modern slavery. We'll hear how this experience has informed the development of the new standard. So our panel today are experts in anti-slavery, human trafficking, human rights, procurement and supply chain development. And I'd like to briefly introduce our first expert speakers to you. So Juliana is a research fellow and policy impact lead based at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. Her work integrates the lived experience into all stages of research and policy engagement. Juliana will be interviewing Keith Lewis from Survivor Alliance, an organisation where empowered survivors formed an anti-slavery movement, creating solutions that support fellow survivors to thrive. Juliana and Keith will be talking for around 20 minutes, and then I will turn to Helen Carter and Catherine Bryant to talk briefly about their work on the standard. So our panel of experts warmly welcome your questions on this work, so please do enter them into the chat during this session, and we'll spend some time answering them a little bit later. So Juliana, handing over to you, please.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Just a slight bit of connection between the Rights Lab and Survivor Alliance and this BSI standard is that the Rights Lab has a world-leading group of researchers and impact experts in modern slavery and human trafficking around the world. And we are based at the University of Nottingham, which is where I'm calling in from today, and we have a long relationship with Survivor Alliance. So we link in. That's a very short overview about how I came to be invited to be a part of the interview with Keith today. So Keith, I'll start chatting with you to make the most of our time, because that's what we're all here to hear from. We're all here to hear your story today. So we've chatted in advance, and I know that you are keen to share parts of your lived experience with us today and what it means to be a survivor, someone who's experienced modern slavery, but also what your experience as a survivor has been in terms of creating the standard. And so that sort of continuum of experiences and that journey after exploitation, as it were, and how you've used that to inform impact and work in the real world. So the first question I want to ask you is, why did you say yes to being involved in this? I know that Survivor Alliance and survivors get a lot of offers and requests for participation in things, and I'm wondering why this request to be a part of the standard writing was something that was worth saying yes to you for.
I believe that, working from being a slave, I was a slave for roughly about 7 years, hard labour. So that was back in mid-90s to early 2000s, which I escaped then. I've worked on building sites where obviously health and safety, British standards has been involved there. When the opportunity came up, I actually thought British standards, and I actually thought, right, this could be, somewhere I can give my input as a survivor towards making life better and more visual to people that wouldn't see things that like I would, being a survivor, in respects of, how people are treated and so forth. So yeah.
Keith, excuse me, it's Dave here. Keith,
yeah.
do you mind turning on your video when you're responding to a question? Is that
right,
okay with you?
I tried to find my video.
It's at the bottom of the you just kind of the bottom of the thing next to the mute button there. I'm sorry for the interruption, Juliana.
That's all right. Thanks, David. So I'll let Keith address that tech query, that tech quest that he's on. I don't know about everybody else, but for me, using Zoom through the platform that we're using today is slightly different. Things are in a slightly different place than I'm used to on Zoom. So I'm not sure if Keith is also experiencing that, but for me, the settings are in different places.
I can't find where the video button is.
For me, it's at the bottom of the screen toward the left. It's not the leftmost button on the bottom, that's the microphone, but it's the second leftmost button.
Nick, is that anything from Lemon Zest? Is that anything you could help with? Or
no, it's not. No, he needs to do it himself in Zoom. I don't have permissions to do it.
But let's crack on anyway, because that's lovely. Keith, if you managed to find it, but Juliana, please continue.
No, I haven't.
Don't worry about it, Keith. Don't worry about it, mate. Carry on.
Well, I can assure you all, Keith has a very friendly, warm demeanor. So you can just imagine a friendly face, and you're not going to be far off from looking at Keith. So the second question I've got for you, Keith, is around the standard. I'm curious to know how you think that this standard is going to benefit victims and the people who are vulnerable to modern slavery in supply chains and in the operations of the businesses that choose to adopt the standard. How will it help the actual vulnerable individuals at the other end of this?
Well, hopefully it's educating the people at the top of the chain to filter down to hopefully eradicate the global it's a global pandemic of slavery, really. And yeah, it's putting awareness out there. Unless awareness is there and people actually know it's there, it's sort of like brushed under the carpet. So it is actually all about getting awareness out there. So yeah, so that answers your question.
It does, and I think you might think that the answer is the same to my next question. My next question is, how will this standard help businesses? So how will it help people at the other end of the spectrum? If we've got survivors and vulnerable individuals on one end where the spectrum, where the standard is concerned, and we have businesses on the other, how will it help businesses to adopt the standard?
Hopefully, businesses will look upon the standards where, let's say, a supermarket, for instance, where they will get their produce. They may choose to, at the moment, look at where they're getting their supplies from and actually move to a friendlier, non-slavery profit, unit where people are treated fair at a fair wage, for what they're doing.
And I know that the standard is above and beyond what the legal requirements on a business are. So I'm wondering from your perspective, as a survivor, Keith, and as somebody who really thought this was a valuable project to contribute to, what is sort of the, what do you think is the best reason, or maybe the top two reasons that a business should adopt this stricter standard, should hold themselves to sort of a higher standard, as it were? And do you think that's an appropriate way of talking about it? That's my language, that's not BSI language. So I'm wondering if you think I've labeled that correctly, and what you think the top two reasons are that businesses should adopt this.
Well, I think you have got it correct. But for the business to have a high learning curve of the British standards, not only with the slavery, the health and safety, it's all interrolled. So to me, the first aspect is it's good business for one, I'd say, and two, they're going to get more employees. They're going to get more. If they're treated fair, word of mouth, especially nowadays the internet, things will be, move along, and people will more move towards that work, whatever it is, knowing they're going to be looked after.
Thanks, Keith. I know that for us at the Rights Lab as a partner with Survivor Alliance, it's really opened our eyes to doing our business in a different way. We are not a commercial entity, we are a research institute, but even so, we have learned so many different ways of working, and collaborating with lived experience experts requires different ways of thinking, different ways of engaging, just like it would require different ways of engaging with anybody who came from a sector, for example, that we haven't worked with before. So I'm not saying that Survivor Alliance is a sector per se, but for us, it's been a learning curve, and it's been a great learning curve. It's been a wonderful growing and stretching experience as an organization. And I know that the creation of the standard, one of the remarkable things about this particular standard was that it was co-created, and you were really bringing that voice of lived experience expertise to the room every time that you were involved in the committee and feedback on drafts of the standard. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what's the value in co-creating something like this? And I'm wondering, I've got some follow-up questions potentially for you, but I'm wondering what you think the value is as a survivor in engaging and co-creating. And I assume there might have been some hard work involved in the committee learning to kind of engage together. Can you reflect a bit on that?
Yeah, it was, to start with, it was a big learning curve for me. I've never done something so big, so intense. When I say intense, I mean like going through notes, going through people's comments on our notes, picking apart things. Having to look back after the meetings over maybe a professional have said in the meeting that I didn't quite understand, or something I've read in the meeting, in the standard. I didn't quite understand what I've had to look at myself. So it's been a learning curve for me, and also hopefully a learning curve for the BSI.
Thank you. And kind of coming on the tail end of that, I'm wondering if you've got advice for people who write standards. So not every standard will necessarily be relevant to modern slavery experts. That might not be the lived experience or the lived experience expertise that each standard needs. But I'm wondering if you've got advice for people on whether they should pursue lived experience expertise on their standard committees when they're writing standards. And I'm wondering if you've got any practical advice. You and I emailed briefly about this as well, so I'm not sure if you've got any sort of practical advice that came to mind after our email thread was over around really what does it look like to involve a lived experience expert who's not necessarily a business professional or a standard writer like yourself.
It's quite a difficult one. I'm sorry, Juliana, would you be able to refresh that a minute for me? Sorry.
Absolutely. The short version, I did go on a bit. The short version is, I apologize. What advice do you have for people who write standards around how they can engage lived experience experts?
My advice is to embrace lived experience. We're living in a world now where, say the police, for instance, if you've got a victim of, say, domestic violence, sometimes they'll bring in someone that's actually survived domestic violence to put the person at ease. Working with people who have lived experience is vital to actually put victims at ease, to actually get an insight into the criminality side of the human trafficking as well. What people get away with under people's noses. I would suggest anyone if they got the opportunity to write in a standard, and it can involve a survivor of some sort, to grasp that opportunity to research on charities regarding what the standard would be. Yeah.
And just a quick follow-up question, Keith. How did the opportunity come about for you to be engaged in this committee?
I've been with Survivors Alliance now from the start, which was 2018. And there was the executive director, Mindan, who got in touch with me. To be honest, at first I didn't think I'd be up for the job. I'm actually registered blind now, so I had that hurdle to actually jump as well. Think, can I really do this? And I have friends, a charity I used to work with in where I'm living, is one of the professors is from the Nottingham, is part of the charity I work with over here, Kevin Bales, and he was his wife as well, pushing me to actually go for this. You can do this, and it's just having that confidence to actually take that leap of faith and try and make a difference.
Thank you. I have another question about the goals of the committee. So I understand Alex and Akila, who were a part of this standard as well, that part of the goal of the committee was to really integrate the aspect around vulnerability and vulnerable people with the interests of enterprise. And so I know that at the beginning, there were serious conversations around how do we integrate the very different aspects around vulnerability, because not every industry looks the same, not every vulnerable person or victim looks the same, so not everybody has the same circumstances. So how do we address the interests of all those different components of what it means to be vulnerable on the one side, and also within the same standard, address the interests of enterprise? So I know that was one of the visions and goals of the committee when they wrote the standard. I'm wondering if you think that that was successful. Is that an objective that was met by your standards, by you personally, by your standards, Keith? Was that objective met?
Yeah, I do believe it was met. We are still working through the comments, and we're hoping for the end of July to publish, which it should be on par. And to, identify vulnerable people. It's certain. If you had said to me, say 4 years ago, I'd be sat here with in a conference with British standards, so probably would have said no chance. I didn't have the courage to speak to the start. But Min Dan, she's been like a mentor towards me, pushed me to do interviews, to do other panels, also do a lot of research in other areas. Yeah, it's all just a learning curve, and I find it is like therapy towards me as well. So it's actually therapeutic to actually go through this and working on something that you can make something better.
I'm wondering, Keith,
Juliana, excuse me. Thank you so much for that. I think their time is just about up there. If you have another question, okay, but I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been watching the time. I think I have a couple more minutes, but what I was just about to say is, Keith, I'd like to give you the extra couple of minutes that I've got on my timer, if you've got anything to add. And after that, I'm happy for it to be handed back over to Sarah.
I would say, our time as survivors is valuable. We should be credited for what we do. I don't think a lot of companies out there actually give us the credits we should have. And I approached the police force about a year into Survivors Alliance and said about me becoming an advisor for them with victims of modern-day slavery, which I was like pushed out the door sort of thing. So it is moving forward, and I believe if you're a survivor and you have got something to bring to the table, every survivor's story is different. Whether it's trafficking or if it's hard labor, but all I say is go for it. We should be also we should be acknowledged as professionals and paid as professionals as well, which has been brought up in other meetings I've been in with, because we are professionals in what we do. I mean, we are professionally trained ourselves, unfortunately, through what we went through.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you both so much, Juliana from the University of Nottingham and to Keith. Audience, do please pop questions into either the Q&A bar or the chat function there. Really appreciate your positive encouragement. Thank you, Keith. I'm going to introduce our next two panelists who will reflect briefly on their involvement in developing the standard. So Helen Carter is a procurement professional and has spent 30 years supporting organisations with procurement and supply chain development. Helen is also an expert in sustainable procurement, and over the last 7 years has been looking at modern slavery and human rights in supply chains. And Catherine Bryant is Head of Policy and Programmes at Walk Free and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. And she oversees their programme on what works to combat modern slavery. And she has worked in counter-trafficking and anti-slavery programming and research for the past decade. So over to you, Helen and Catherine, on your reflections and involvement in the standard. And then we'll come to the audience question and answers.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll go first. Catherine, just butting afterwards. I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself in a moment. Firstly, thank you to Keith. It's always good to hear experiences, and Keith's a very valuable member of our committee. So it's great to hear you share your story, Keith. Thank you for that. I can't really add too much more other than my background is, as we've said, procurement, and more recently looking at modern slavery and supply chain sort of human rights issues. And when the opportunity came to look at a standard, I think Amanda's on the call, she knew that I badgered her to heck and back to make sure that I could get involved, because I think it's really important that businesses understand that roadmap of what to do in terms of lack of knowledge around modern slavery, what it actually is over what they perceive it to be, and also that the response is more than legislation. And I've seen a very interesting question in the chat already around that, so we can address that later on. So I am passionate about supply chains. Keith's experience is very much around the direct issues of modern slavery, but I'm equally as passionate around the indirect issues as well that see modern slavery in supply chains embedded throughout the globe in products and services that we use in the UK. And I think that's another bit of the standard that really helps. So I was really pleased to get involved, really pleased to talk about supply chains and procurement, because I can talk about that for hours. But that's sort of me and why I got involved. The expert, I like to say I know some stuff. I do know some stuff, but I will hand over to Catherine, who knows a heck of a lot more than me probably in this space. So Catherine, do you want to do an intro?
Thanks, Helen, and that's not true at all. And thanks also to Keith for sharing some valuable insights into the added value that those with lived experience can provide to this kind of process, and more broadly to all of our anti-slavery work. So as Sarah said at the beginning, my name is Catherine Bryant. I'm Head of Policy and Programmes at Walk Free. A very quick spiel. Walk Free, if you're not familiar with it, is an anti-slavery organisation. We are an evidence-based advocacy organisation which aims to eradicate modern slavery within our generation, and we are best known for the Global Slavery Index, which some people might be familiar with. It provides estimates of modern slavery at the national level for approximately 160 odd countries. So my motivation for being involved in this standard is firstly people like Keith. So we obviously work on a lot of data, a lot of evidence. We estimate there's something like 40.3 million people living in modern slavery, 17 million which are in private supply chains. So it's those individuals who really motivated me to want to work on this. But more kind of practically speaking, in terms of our direct experience of Walk Free, we engage directly with businesses. We're very privileged to be founded and funded by a West Australian businessman. And through our engagement, we get lots of questions about how we tackle this. The question on UK legislation I'll touch on now, but we'll get into a bit more detail. There are legislative frameworks out there. There's the UK Modern Slavery Act, Section 54, which directly applies to business. There's the Australian Modern Slavery Act from 2008. There's also mandatory human rights due diligence developments across Europe, but actually so many often businesses come to us saying, great, this is a standard, but how can I actually implement this? And one of the great things that the standard does is really provide detailed guidance for businesses of how to tackle these issues. And one piece in particular that I'll highlight before I pass back to Sarah is the piece on remediation in particular. Companies often are very stumped about how to actually engage with issues or instances of modern slavery within their supply chains. It's highly likely they are affected by modern slavery and forced labor in their supply chains, but they don't really know what to do about it. And it's a bit of a black box in terms of other companies sharing that information of what they have done to tackle it. So I think this is great in terms of providing that really practical guidance of how to actually go about that. So I've kind of, this is my part of my motivation, and also slightly answer that question, but I think, yeah, it would be great to kind of drill into that first question, because I think there's a lot of interesting things. I know Helen would definitely want to add on that.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, so the question in the chat is UK legislation on modern slavery is quite strong. Please can you tell us what the standard offers that legislation does not cover? And I think just to clarify also that the modern slavery statement that companies, so there is a financial cap there, isn't there? It's something like a turnover of 36 million that you must reach before you are obliged to legally or statutory log your statement. But I guess that's legislation deals with that upwards. So who else is going to benefit from the standard, I guess, is the question that Adrian is also asking. So Helen, would you like to have a go at that first? Yeah, great.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I know Catherine will film the bits that I miss. It's interesting about the legislation. Most people think that there's legislation in place. Most of the clients that I work with through Action Sustainability and the organisations I train in the supply chain school go, I have a statement, therefore I'm compliant. The legislation basically stops there. The reality is that the UK legislation is no longer leading, and that's my personal opinion. It's actually quite low down the pecking order now in terms of the legislation that's coming out. If we look at EU legislation, if we look at German legislation, if we see legislation coming from places like America that's going to be imposed recently on things like forced labour and Uyghur camps, that is now focusing on due diligence. Not producing a statement, but the due diligence activity. It's implied in the UK legislation through the statement. It's expected that businesses have due diligence and report it through the statement. But through my experience of working with clients, what we see is people produce a statement first and think about due diligence last, because it's a regulatory requirement. So this standard is actually trying to get businesses to go beyond, I just have to produce a statement. They can produce a statement at the end of it if they want. But there's this particular piece in the UK legislation that we're seeing increasingly applied, which is the civil litigation issue. So you may or may not be familiar with something called Operation Fort, which is basically one of the biggest prosecutions where businesses are now being subjected to civil litigation from victims who were found in their supply chains. It doesn't matter whether your business is 36 million or not, you need due diligence. And I think that's the key here, is that the standard is trying to get you to think about due diligence beyond just giving it to the legal department and telling them it's their job, beyond giving it to the procurement team and saying put something in the procurement ITT, getting you to think about actually how you go deeper into your supply chains, because that's momentum at this space. And I noticed the particular person who asked the questions from the collaboration piece, we got a lot bit in there on collaboration, on how actually we can work collectively together. So the standard does actually go way beyond the legal compliance, mainly because if you drill into legal compliance, it's quite light, really, for what you need to do. It's more about good practice, and due diligence is not unfamiliar, I think, to lots of organisations. It's just about expanding it further now, which is the way a lot of global legislation is going, albeit the UK might not be quite there yet. Sorry, long answer, but hopefully that helps.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And Helen, anything? Sorry, Helen, Catherine, anything else to add to that? Sorry, I'm looking at all my controls and getting muddled up. Catherine.
No worries at all. I think Helen's covered it perfectly, but I think I would say that it's a part of the research we do at Walk Free is also looking at the statements being produced under both the UK and the Australian Modern Slavery Acts. We did a comparison piece recently looking at the garment industry in particular. I would also agree, Helen, again, from a personal perspective, the UK legislation is probably a bit lagging a bit now in terms of other comparative pieces. The Australian legislation, for example, provides mandatory criteria, which makes it a lot easier for companies to actually to inform the content of company statements, whereas in the UK there's some guidance and it's very vague and it's not very detailed for companies. And I think that part about the guidance and where it adds value is it goes beyond kind of what should be kind of mandatory, what is this kind of base layer of what companies should be doing, to actually provide kind of good standards of what companies should be reporting and what they should be actions they should be tackling or taking if they're really honest about tackling this particular issue. I could talk about the strengths and the relative weaknesses of legislation, but yeah, I think this is one part where it goes beyond to look at that good practice part.
Great, thank you very much. So in the few minutes we have remaining, I guess another question to you all is, the standard is, and Juliana as well, do feel free to chip in if you would like. The standard addresses a sort of deeply ingrained, very wicked sort of social problem, I would say, which is sort of new ground that BSI is beginning to move into, certainly in the governance world. So how important has this experience of tying together direct experience into a piece of guidance? What advice would you give to other standards writers? How has that been for you? How easy or how difficult has that been? And maybe start with Helen first, and then I'll come around.
Thanks, Sarah. One of the things when we created the standard, and in fact relates to modern slavery and human rights due diligence, is that the worker is at the heart of what is produced. And I think it's a reflection on a growing business world that's starting to realize the sort of equality and diversity of the voices that it has contained within it, influencing the way it's run. We're seeing that particularly with the next generations. So Keith, coming to the table with your experience, and then obviously being involved with organisations who are involved with other survivors, I think means that we've got much more of a standard that can resonate with all the relevant stakeholders. And it's been really interesting. If we look at the panel and committee, we have businesses, of which I am involved in. We've got NGOs, we've got the Survivor Alliance, we've got people who write standards, because I don't write standards, I don't know how you do it. So what I think that gives us is a really good balance, and I think it's been incredibly important in making sure that we do have that balanced approach, which allows us to write something that I think is pragmatic and achievable and usable. The final thing, and I'll shut up, is that this is a guidance standard, which I know is a bit Marmite in the standards world. You either love them or hate them. But I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is that because this is such a sophisticated subject, it's a very interconnected subject with lots and lots of things. It can't be seen as a compliance standard. It can't be seen as a tick box and we eradicate modern slavery. The guidance allows us that sort of spongy effect, if you like, that sort of breathable effect of a way of doing things, which will allow it to apply to SMEs or large businesses or anything along those lines. So I think it's been pretty valuable having that balanced approach with all those different people, and people like Keith, who have brought so much knowledge, because people are at the heart of what the standard's trying to help.
Lovely, thank you. Juliana, any reflections yourself on that question?
Just briefly, that from a Rights Lab perspective, we know that, as others have already said, people are really starting to make decisions about whether they as businesses, and in some cases whether whole sectors, are going to address modern slavery and some of those other kind of wicked issues of our day. And so we really welcome the opportunity to be a part of this standard, because we thought, well, there will be some kind of standard set, whether that was a BSI standard or an international standard or simply a de facto standard that emerges because of practice that becomes common. We wanted to be a part of really creating that and speaking into it, because there is really robust, really reliable and serious evidence that modern slavery exists in almost every pocket of the world where there are humans. And so we know that it's in the things that our businesses here in Britain create. We know that it's in the things that we procure. We know that it is touched, those products and those goods are touched by slave labor, and sometimes it's services that are touched by slave labor as well. And so I think it, for us, was just really valuable to say, let's, from an impact perspective, that's my role in the Rights Lab is as a research fellow and impact expert. We said, yeah, it might not necessarily be that this is proprietary Rights Lab research, but we're here to champion the efficacy of modern slavery research generally and say, what impact can it have? And we were especially delighted. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, actually sort of conditional on saying, but let's please engage lived experience experts, because that is also what we've got very serious commitments to and research for. So that it's not just a moral commitment to engage lived experience experts for us and things we engage in, it's also, from a kind of cut and dry perspective, it's empirically evidenced that you've got to involve lived experience experts if you want your end result, your end product, in this case, the standard, to be feasible and to have any efficacy.
Lovely, thank you very much, Juliana. And Catherine, I'll give you the final word to you on that lived experience and in standards writing. How's that been for you?
I think in a way, to be slightly cheesy, I think it set the standard for producing standards, because what it's doing is obviously involving those who are directly impacted by the standard itself. And in some ways, it's, you know, a no-brainer that you would actually involve those who have been have lived experience, who've been affected by these forms of exploitation, in writing the standards that then will help to make their situation better. So yeah, I think it's been a completely invaluable process, and something that we can all take from, both in terms of producing standards, but more broadly, I know, into Walfrey's work involving survivors in every aspect of our research, policy, advocacy, etc. So yeah, setting the standard for standard production.
Great, what a nice soundbite to end on. Thank you very much. So thank you all very much for your time today. To Keith, I think we're rapidly reaching the end of the session. So thank you to the audience. Thank you to all of those of you involved in writing this standard. And as Keith said, he gave a little plug earlier, this so BS 25700 is will be published at the end of July. So do look out for it, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of fanfare around it. So that concludes our session today. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.